What happens when your family ignores your desperate plea for help, only to find themselves facing a courtroom? Edith's fight for dignity turns her world upside down. What happened next sent shockwaves through the entire community. Edith had never thought of herself as fragile. At 78, she still tended her garden, drove to her weekly card club, and rarely complained about her arthritis, even on the coldest mornings. But on the first Monday of April, everything changed. It began with a sudden stabbing pain in her chest that jolted Edith awake just before dawn. She sat up, gasping, a cold sweat breaking out on her brow. The pain spread to her left arm, sharp, burning, terrifying. Edith fumbled for her phone, hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. She managed to call her daughter, Lisa, whose number was on speed dial. After several rings, a groggy voice answered. "Mom, it's early. Is something wrong?" Edith struggled to speak. "Lisa, I need help. My chest," she gasped, clutching her side. "I think I'm having a heart attack." Lisa sighed, the sound heavy with annoyance. "Mom, you're always so dramatic. Did you take your blood pressure pills? It's probably just anxiety. Try to relax, okay? I'll call you later." Then the line went dead. Stunned, Edith stared at her phone. Panic surged in her veins, her breath coming in ragged bursts. She tried calling her son, Mark, next. The call went straight to voicemail. She left a desperate message, voice barely above a whisper. "Mark, please, I need help. Please call me back." Her vision swam. She felt her world narrowing to a pinpoint of pain and fear. Minutes dragged by. Edith, desperate, pressed the emergency button on her home alert necklace. The device beeped, and a calm operator's voice came through. "Ms. Winters, are you in distress?" Edith could barely speak, but the operator immediately called for an ambulance. Relief washed over her, mingled with humiliation. Why hadn't her own children listened? The paramedics arrived quickly, rushing Edith to the hospital. In the ambulance, one of them gripped her hand, reassuring her as they hooked her up to wires and monitors. "You did the right thing calling us, ma'am. We'll take care of you." Tears slid down Edith's cheeks, not just from fear, but from the betrayal of her own family. In the emergency room, doctors worked quickly. A mild heart attack, they told her, but she'd arrived in time. Edith nodded, grateful to be alive, but the ache in her chest wasn't just physical. As she lay in the sterile hospital bed, her phone silent, she thought about all the years she'd cared for her children. The nights she'd rocked them to sleep, the mornings she'd packed their lunches, the weekends she'd spent cheering at games and dance recitals. Now, when she needed them most, they had dismissed her fear as a nuisance. The hospital social worker visited later that afternoon, her tone gentle but probing. "Do you have family nearby, Mrs. Winters? Anyone who can help during your recovery?" Edith hesitated, a flush of shame rising. "I have children, but—" she trailed off, eyes brimming with tears. The social worker patted her hand and made a note in her file. Lisa called that evening, her voice breezy. "Well, Mom, you sound better. See? I told you it was probably nothing. I'm glad you're at the hospital, but I can't get away from work right now. Mark's busy with the kids, too. Maybe next week we can stop by. Just rest, okay?" Edith hung up, anger and sadness warring in her chest. Mark didn't call at all. During Edith's stay, the nurses became her lifeline. They chatted as they changed her dressings, brought extra blankets, and cheered her up with stories about their own families. When the hospital chaplain stopped in, Edith finally admitted her feelings. "It hurts," she whispered. "Not just here, but here." She pressed a trembling hand to her heart. When Edith was discharged 3 days later, the social worker arranged for home health visits and checked that she had groceries and medication. Edith's children did not come to pick her up. Instead, a hospital volunteer drove her home, making awkward small talk about the weather. Edith thanked her, struggling to keep her composure as she stepped into her empty house. That evening, as the sun set and Edith sat alone, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Lisa. "Glad you're home. Don't forget your pills. Call if you need anything, unless it's urgent. I'm swamped this week." Edith stared at the screen, rage and disbelief knotting in her chest. She spent the night replaying every moment, every conversation, every memory of the children she'd raised and the loneliness they now left her in. As darkness fell, Edith came to a decision. She would not be dismissed, belittled, or ignored, not after what she had survived. And for the first time in her life, she thought seriously about what it would mean to hold her family accountable. Edith's first days home from the hospital were a mixture of slow healing and simmering anger. Each morning, she measured out her pills and forced herself to eat toast and fruit, her hands still trembling from the ordeal. The visiting nurse arrived promptly at 9, cheerful and brisk, checking Edith's vitals and reviewing her medication routine. "You're stronger than you look," the nurse smiled, gently changing the bandage on Edith's arm. "But you'll need to take it easy for a while. No heavy lifting, no stress." The words stung. Edith thought of the empty house, the meal she prepared for one, the silence that settled after each call with her children ended as quickly as it began. Lisa continued to text, always brief, always distracted, reminding Edith to rest up and call if it's urgent. Mark, on the other hand, sent nothing at all. A few neighbors dropped by with get-well cards and small casseroles, offering polite sympathy. Edith was grateful, but she found herself rehearsing the story of her medical emergency in her head, the shame and disbelief growing each time she told it. Mrs. Callahan from next door listened, her brow furrowing as Edith recounted how Lisa brushed her off, how Mark never even called. "You're not the only one, Edith," Mrs. Callahan sighed. "My niece was the same with my sister. Some people just don't want the burden." That word, burden, echoed in Edith's mind for days. She had spent her whole life putting her children first. How had she become a burden overnight? At night, lying in her quiet bedroom, Edith found herself replaying years of sacrifice, of love given without question or complaint. All she'd wanted in return was a little care in her moment of need. When the home health nurse visited again, Edith broke down in tears. "My family left me alone," she admitted, voice cracking. The nurse listened, squeezing Edith's hand. "You're not alone, Mrs. Winters. And you don't have to just accept this." The nurse told her about support groups for seniors, places to share stories, even get advice on legal matters when families neglect their obligations. She left behind a flyer for the local Elder Advocacy Center. Restless, Edith took the advice. She called the Advocacy Center and explained her story to a volunteer named Barbara. Barbara listened without judgment, her questions gentle but pointed. Had Edith documented her calls to Lisa and Mark? Did she have copies of her medical records? Would she be willing to meet with a case worker? "There are laws to protect you, Edith," Barbara explained. "You don't have to just accept being ignored." For the first time since her heart attack, Edith felt a flicker of hope. Maybe her pain wasn't just her burden to bear. Maybe it was part of something bigger, a pattern that shouldn't be swept aside. Edith gathered her medical records, saved text messages, and printed out the call logs from her phone. The process was slow and emotional, each document a reminder of both her vulnerability and her strength. She attended a support group at the Advocacy Center, where she met others who shared similar stories, of children who disappeared when help was needed most, of emergencies dismissed as drama, of wounds that ran far deeper than the physical. The stories emboldened her. Edith spoke to the group, her voice shaking but determined. They didn't just ignore a phone call. They ignored a cry for help. "That can't be right." The group leader nodded. "You're not alone, Edith. We can help you." Barbara connected Edith with a pro bono attorney, Ms. Vasquez, who specialized in elder neglect. During their first meeting, Ms. Vasquez listened intently, asking for every detail of Edith's emergency and her family's response, or lack thereof. "You have a right to expect care, especially from those who benefit from your love and labor," the attorney said. "Neglect is not just cruel. Sometimes, it's illegal." The first step, Ms. Vasquez explained, was to file an official complaint and request a formal investigation. Edith hesitated, torn by guilt and loyalty, but ultimately she signed the forms with trembling hands. "You're brave," Ms. Vasquez told her. "You're standing up not just for yourself, but for everyone who's ever been left behind." News spread quietly among Edith's neighbors and friends. Some were shocked, others supportive. A few gossiped, but most expressed admiration for Edith's resolve. Even Mrs. Callahan, who'd once pitied her, now offered words of encouragement. "You're doing the right thing, Edith. Maybe now they'll understand what you went through." As the days passed, Edith began to sense a shift. The loneliness and shame began to recede, replaced by a growing determination. Each morning, as she sipped tea and watched the sunrise from her window, Edith whispered to herself, "I will not be ignored." She didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in weeks, she was ready to fight for herself, and for everyone who had ever suffered in silence. A week after Edith filed her complaint, she received a formal letter from the county's Adult Protective Services. An investigator named Mr. Tomlin would be in touch to review her case. The words felt surreal. Edith had always been the one to solve problems quietly, but now her pain and outrage were official, stamped and filed. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the envelope, wondering how things had come to this. The next morning, Mr. Tomlin called and scheduled a home visit. Edith spent the day cleaning, fussing over every detail, the sort of nervousness she hadn't felt since Lisa's first parent-teacher conference decades ago. She stacked her medical records neatly, set out her phone with the text logs displayed, and tried to steel herself for what lay ahead. When Mr. Tomlin arrived, he was younger than Edith expected, but kind-eyed and patient. He listened closely as she told her story: the calls for help, Lisa's brusque dismissal, Mark's silence, the ambulance, the days alone in the hospital. He examined the medical records and her phone, nodding as Edith's voice grew steadier. "You did the right thing documenting everything, Mrs. Winters," he said. "You're not alone in this. Too many cases go unreported." They walked through Edith's recovery, the visits from the nurse, the support group meetings, her decision to seek legal help. Mr. Tomlin took careful notes, asking questions about her children's involvement in her life before the emergency and whether there was any pattern of neglect. Edith, surprised by her own candor, realized she'd been minimizing her feelings for years, apologizing for being a bother, downplaying her loneliness, masking her needs with polite smiles. "Your children have a legal and moral duty of care," Mr. Tomlin explained gently. "This isn't just about a single event. It's about a pattern, and about what you need now to live safely and with dignity." After he left, Edith felt exhausted but strangely lighter. She spent the afternoon in her garden, pruning the roses and thinking of all the years she'd spent caring for others. The familiar rhythm soothed her nerves, and she found herself talking quietly to her late husband as she worked. "I never thought it would come to this, Bill," she murmured, brushing dirt from her hands. "But I won't be invisible." A few days later, Ms. Vasquez, her attorney, called with news. The complaint had triggered an investigation, and Lisa and Mark would be contacted by authorities for their statements. Edith felt a pang of guilt. She could picture Lisa's indignant scowl, Mark's bewildered silence, but she pressed on. "You're doing the right thing, Edith," Ms. Vasquez reassured her. "Sometimes, it takes a shock for people to realize the consequences of their actions." Support grew from unexpected places. Mrs. Callahan rallied the neighborhood, organizing a meal train and checking in on Edith daily. The support group members sent cards and called regularly, sharing their own stories of small triumphs and setbacks. The home nurse brought flowers from her garden, and even the mailman lingered on the porch, offering a sympathetic ear. Edith realized that family could be found in unlikely places, that kindness, once extended, often returned. Meanwhile, the investigation caused ripples in Edith's family. Lisa's tone on the phone shifted, defensive and clipped. "Why are you doing this to us, Mom?" she snapped during a rushed call. Edith, voice steady, replied, "I called for help, Lisa. You didn't come. You need to understand how much that hurt." Mark's silence, if anything, grew heavier. Claire, Lisa's daughter, sent a brief but heartfelt text. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I didn't know. Let me know if you need anything." Edith's days filled with doctor appointments, legal paperwork, and counseling sessions. She learned more about her rights, how elder neglect could be prosecuted, what restitution might look like, how the legal process would unfold. Each step was daunting, but with each one, Edith's resolve deepened. She was standing up not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been left behind by those they trusted most. One afternoon, Mr. Tomlin returned for a follow-up, bringing with him a representative from the district attorney's office. They explained the next steps: interviews, mediation, and possibly a court case. Edith listened carefully, her heart pounding with both fear and pride. "I want to see this through," she told them, "for myself, and for all the people who've ever been afraid to speak up." That evening, as the sun set behind her tidy house, Edith brewed a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the world go by. The ache of betrayal lingered, but something new had taken root alongside it, a fierce, quiet courage she'd never known she possessed. In the weeks that followed, the wheels of justice turned slowly, but steadily. Edith's case became a topic of quiet conversation at the Advocacy Center, where Ms. Vasquez explained each step of the process with patience. Edith met with a counselor, who helped her navigate the complex emotions that came with taking legal action against her own children. Anger, grief, guilt, and, unexpectedly, a growing sense of relief. One morning, a letter from the county prosecutor arrived. It detailed the preliminary findings of the Adult Protective Services investigation. There was evidence to support a claim of elder neglect. Edith read and reread the letter, hands trembling. The document included copies of her medical records, her emergency call logs, and statements taken from the visiting nurse and the paramedics who'd treated her. Their words reinforced what Edith already knew. She had not been overreacting. She had been abandoned in her hour of need. The district attorney's office reached out next, inviting Edith to a mediation meeting with Lisa and Mark. The session would be conducted by a neutral mediator, whose job was to help the family discuss what had happened and determine if there was any hope of reconciliation or restitution before the case moved to court. The thought of facing Lisa and Mark in person filled Edith with dread, but she knew it was necessary. Ms. Vasquez prepared her for what to expect, encouraging her to write down everything she wanted to say, her feelings, her needs, her boundaries. "This is your moment to speak your truth," the attorney said. "You owe them honesty, but not forgiveness unless you're ready." On the day of the mediation, Edith dressed with care, choosing a deep blue blouse and her husband's old watch. She arrived at the county building early, accompanied by Ms. Vasquez. The waiting room was tense. Lisa sat stiffly in a chair, arms crossed, face pinched with resentment. Mark stared at his hands, refusing to meet Edith's eyes. When the mediator ushered them in, Edith took a steadying breath and spoke first. She described, in painful detail, the terror of that morning, the agony in her chest, the desperate calls, the silence that followed. "I wasn't asking for much," she said quietly. "Just for someone to listen. To believe me. To be there." Lisa's eyes flashed, but Mark's face crumpled in shame. The mediator invited Lisa and Mark to respond. Lisa launched into a litany of excuses: work, stress, believing it was just anxiety. She insisted she never meant harm, but Edith could see the anger behind her daughter's words. Mark's reply was quieter. "I should have called back, Mom. I'm sorry. I messed up. I just didn't think it was real." Ms. Vasquez pressed for specifics. Why had they ignored Edith's pleas? Why hadn't they checked on her after the hospital called? The answers were hollow. Lisa cited burnout. Mark admitted to being distracted by his own problems. Edith listened, heart heavy, but a cold clarity settling over her. Their explanations didn't erase the pain or the danger she'd faced alone. The mediator outlined possible outcomes: a court case, a settlement, mandated counseling, or community service. Edith, voice clear, stated her needs: an acknowledgement of the harm done, restitution for medical bills not covered by insurance, and a commitment that this would never happen again. She requested family counseling if her children wished to remain in her life, but made it clear that her boundaries would not bend. Lisa bristled at the demands, but Mark nodded, his shame deepening. The mediator called for a break, allowing everyone to gather themselves. Ms. Vasquez leaned over to Edith. "You're doing incredibly well. Whatever happens, you've already made them face what they tried to ignore." Back in the mediation room, Lisa and Mark were given one last chance to respond to Edith's terms. Lisa balked at financial restitution, arguing it would put a strain on her family, but the mediator explained that neglect had real, measurable consequences. Mark agreed to the counseling and restitution, offering to help coordinate Edith's medical appointments in the future. The meeting ended with no immediate resolution, but the message was clear. Edith was no longer willing to be dismissed or minimized. She had stood her ground, spoken her truth, and forced her family to see the reality of their actions. That night, Edith walked through her garden as dusk fell, feeling a strange calm. The roses glowed in the fading light, sturdy and resilient. For the first time in months, she felt a measure of peace, a sense that, no matter what happened next, she had reclaimed her dignity. The mediation had left Edith both drained and emboldened. In the days that followed, she received follow-up calls from the mediator and Ms. Vasquez, each checking in and preparing her for the next phase. Mark's offer to help with her appointments was genuine. He called twice that week, even driving Edith to a doctor's visit and waiting patiently in the lobby. Their conversations were awkward at first, but Mark apologized again, this time in private. "I let you down, Mom. I was selfish. I want to do better." Lisa, however, kept her distance. Her messages were curt, laced with resentment. Edith sensed that her daughter felt cornered, angry that her mother had brought outsiders into the family's business. Still, Lisa grudgingly agreed to participate in the counseling sessions the mediator had mandated as a precondition to any settlement. The counseling sessions were tense and emotional. The therapist, an experienced woman with a gentle but unyielding manner, set ground rules for honesty and respect. Edith spoke about the trauma of being ignored, the humiliation of relying on strangers, and the fear that still haunted her. She described the moment she realized that her love and sacrifices had not guaranteed care or compassion when it mattered most. Lisa resisted at first, blaming work, the economy, the stress of being pulled in every direction. But as the sessions went on, she was forced to listen not just to Edith, but to Mark, who admitted how deeply he'd failed their mother. Gradually, cracks appeared in Lisa's anger. "I just felt so overwhelmed," she said one afternoon, her voice shaking. "I thought if I ignored it, it would go away. I never meant for you to be hurt, Mom. I just couldn't handle it all." The therapist pushed them all to consider boundaries, expectations, and the hard truth that love alone wasn't enough. Responsibility and presence mattered too. Edith, for the first time, felt heard. She set clear boundaries for her needs, honest communication, regular check-ins, and respect for her decisions. She refused to let guilt keep her from protecting herself. Outside of counseling, Edith's support system continued to blossom. Mrs. Callahan invited her for weekly tea. The home nurse checked in with cheerful efficiency. The advocacy center connected her to a local group that lobbied for elder protection laws. Edith found herself invited to speak at a town hall about her experience. Nervous but determined, she stood before a room full of neighbors and officials, telling her story without shame or bitterness. Just facts, pain, and the desire for change. News of Edith's case, though anonymized, reached other seniors in the community. Some stopped her at the market, quietly thanking her for speaking up. Others shared their own stories of neglect and isolation. The advocacy center saw an uptick in calls, and the local paper published an editorial urging families to do better by those who raised us. Meanwhile, the legal case moved forward. Ms. Vasquez kept Edith updated as negotiations with Lisa's and Mark's attorneys unfolded. Mark had already agreed to restitution and ongoing support, but Lisa continued to push back, her pride unwilling to accept fault. The district attorney's office made it clear, if no agreement was reached, the matter would proceed to court, with the full details of Edith's medical emergency and the neglect she suffered becoming public record. For Edith, the process was grueling, but every step strengthened her resolve. She refused to be dismissed, ignored, or treated as a burden. She realized that her fight was about more than compensation. It was about dignity, respect, and the right to be cared for when most vulnerable. One evening, after a particularly difficult counseling session, Edith sat with Mark in her living room, the silence between them finally comfortable. Mark handed her a cup of tea. "You're brave, Mom. I wish I'd seen it sooner." Edith smiled softly, the bitterness ebbing away. "It's never too late to do right, Mark. But it is too late to pretend nothing happened." As summer crept in, Edith found herself walking a little taller. She was no longer afraid to ask for what she needed. The house still felt quiet sometimes, but it was a peaceful quiet, a space she'd earned. And every morning, as the sun rose, Edith whispered to herself, "I will not be invisible. Not now. Not ever." The weeks marched on, and Edith's world, once small and fearful, felt wide with possibility. She became a fixture at the advocacy center's meetings, her calm but determined voice inspiring others to speak up. At the monthly town hall, Edith's story spurred a heated discussion about the responsibilities of adult children and the isolation facing so many seniors. She listened to other stories, some far worse than her own, and realized she was no longer just fighting for herself, she was a part of something larger. Her case, now a subject of local headlines, began to draw more attention. Journalists requested interviews, which Edith, after consulting Ms. Vasquez, sometimes granted. She was careful to focus not on anger, but on the need for dignity and safety for all elders. "It's about making sure nobody is left alone or afraid," she told one reporter, her voice steady but full of feeling. "It's not just my fight. It could happen to anyone." Lisa's resistance softened under the glare of publicity and the pressure of ongoing negotiations. The threat of a public trial, and the risk of her own name appearing in court documents, began to weigh on her. She called Edith, voice quieter than it had been in years. "Mom, I don't want this to get uglier. I know I failed you. I'm sorry." The apology was raw, and while it didn't erase the past, it was the first sign of genuine remorse. Mark, meanwhile, proved reliable. He called twice a week, showed up for doctor visits, and even attended one of the advocacy center's open meetings to learn how he could do better. The siblings barely spoke to each other, but Edith refused to get in the middle. For once, she made her own well-being her top priority. The advocacy center asked Edith to help develop a pamphlet on elder neglect, what it looked like, what to do, where to get help. Edith threw herself into the project, combining practical advice with personal stories. When the first batch arrived from the printer, she held a copy in trembling hands, heart swelling with pride. She delivered stacks to the library, the hospital, the grocery store, and even the post office, where the clerk taped one to the counter for all to see. Edith's sense of accomplishment grew with each small act. She began hosting a weekly tea at her house for others who felt alone, turning her living room into a space for sharing and support. The laughter, the stories, the warmth, these gatherings felt like a balm, slowly mending the places in her heart left raw by her children's neglect. Meanwhile, Ms. Vasquez pressed on with the legal process. She kept Edith informed as settlement negotiations continued. Lisa, now facing the real possibility of court, started participating more fully in counseling and even attended a public panel on elder care at the library. There, she listened in silence as Edith, calm and resolute, spoke of her journey, not with bitterness, but with the wisdom of someone who had found her own strength. As summer ripened, Edith's days filled with projects, calls, and new friendships. She walked her garden each morning, pausing to marvel at the resilience of her roses, how they bloomed brighter after every storm. She thought of the quiet power that had awakened within her, and how it had changed not only her life, but the lives of others, too. One afternoon, surrounded by her tea group, Edith caught herself laughing, freely, without shame or fear. She realized she'd come further than she ever thought possible, and that she had become, in her own way, a beacon for others. As evening settled over her home, Edith made a promise to herself. No matter the outcome, she would not go back to silence. Her story was now a lifeline, stretching far beyond her own garden gate. As August wore on, the legal pressure reached its peak. Lisa's attorney contacted Ms. Vasquez with a new proposal, a settlement that included not just restitution for Edith's uncovered medical bills, but also a written apology and a formal agreement for regular wellness checks and support. Mark readily signed, eager to close this painful chapter and focus on rebuilding trust with his mother. Lisa, though still resentful, was worn down by months of scrutiny and the fear of public embarrassment. At a final mediation session, she handed Edith the letter herself. Her voice trembled as she read, "I'm sorry for failing you when you needed me. I promised to do better. I can't erase the past, but I will not repeat it." For the first time, Edith believed she meant it, not just for herself, but for her children and future generations. Ms. Vasquez and the district attorney's office formalized the settlement, ensuring the family's obligations were documented and legally binding. The paperwork was daunting, but Edith felt lighter with every signature. She no longer worried about being dismissed. Her boundaries and dignity were now protected by law. The Advocacy Center invited Edith to speak at a regional conference on elder rights, her story now a beacon for others who suffered in silence. She spoke without bitterness, describing the pain of her family's neglect and the long road to justice and healing. The crowd's applause was warm, and several people approached her afterward to thank her for her courage. One man, his voice shaking, whispered, "Because of you, I'm calling my mother tonight." At home, the changes were real. Mark visited often, sometimes bringing groceries or simply sitting with Edith in her blooming garden. Their relationship, scarred but healing, became a quiet comfort. Lisa called regularly, sometimes out of duty, sometimes out of guilt, but Edith sensed a new respect beneath her words. At counseling, Lisa admitted, "I know I hurt you, Mom. I want to make amends." Edith accepted the apology, her heart softer now but her standards unchanged. The tea group at Edith's house grew as word spread of her journey. New faces appeared every week, men and women who had once been silent about their pain. The group shared stories, swapped advice, and celebrated small victories together. Edith found joy in giving comfort and courage to others, often ending each gathering with her favorite reminder, "We are not alone. We deserve to be seen." With settlement funds, Edith finally made long-delayed repairs to her home. She bought a new kettle, new chairs for her guests, and planted a patch of wildflowers just beyond the roses, a living reminder that even after trauma, life could bloom again. One evening, Edith sat with Mark in the fading light. He glanced at her, guilt still flickering in his eyes. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he said softly. "You fought for yourself, and for all of us." Edith squeezed his hand, knowing the journey wasn't perfect but grateful they'd begun to find their way back. As summer's end approached, Edith realized her victory was about more than money or even family. It was about the courage to insist that her life, her pain, and her dignity mattered. She looked out over her garden, the wildflowers swaying in the breeze, and knew she had changed more than her own story. She had helped change the world around her, too. September arrived with a gentle chill, and Edith found herself savoring each golden day. Her life, once defined by waiting and disappointment, now moved with a steady, purposeful rhythm. She rose early, tending her roses and wildflowers, breathing in the promise of the morning. The house was filled with small but meaningful routines, preparing tea for her weekly group, answering calls from new friends at the advocacy center, and writing letters of encouragement to seniors who'd reached out after hearing her story. The settlement had given Edith more than security. It had restored her sense of agency. She invested in a medical alert system, updated her will, and met with a financial advisor to ensure her needs would always come first. Edith's legal victory became a case study at the advocacy center, inspiring policy discussions and training for healthcare providers and social workers. Her words, "I will not be invisible," were printed on flyers, taped up in senior centers and libraries throughout the county. Lisa's relationship with Edith remained careful but honest. The apology letter, read and reread, now rested in Edith's nightstand. Lisa continued counseling and kept her promises, checking in twice a week, sometimes joining Edith's tea group or helping her navigate new technology. Trust rebuilt itself slowly, each conversation a stone in a bridge neither thought they'd ever cross again. Mark, ever loyal, became Edith's steadfast supporter, visiting for coffee, mowing her lawn, and inviting her to family meals. The tea group thrived. At every meeting, someone new found the courage to share their own story of neglect, heartbreak, or triumph. Edith listened, offering compassion and hard-earned wisdom. The group began organizing outreach projects, delivering meals to homebound neighbors, writing letters to isolated elders, and even campaigning for stronger elder care policies at the county level. At the annual advocacy conference, Edith was asked to give the keynote address. Standing at the podium before a packed auditorium, she spoke plainly. "We are not burdens. We are not invisible. Our stories matter. And when we speak, together, change happens." The audience rose in a standing ovation. Several approached her afterward in tears, grateful for her bravery and hope. Back home, Edith reflected on the long journey she'd traveled. There were scars, yes, moments of grief and loneliness that would never fully fade. But her life had become a patchwork of old pain and new purpose, each piece stitched together by her refusal to accept silence. One evening, Edith sat on her porch as the sun set, the air fragrant with the scent of roses and wildflowers. She sipped her tea, smiling as the voices of her friends drifted from the living room. She was not alone, not anymore. She had faced her family, her fears, and a world that so often tried to render her unseen. Edith knew she had fought for herself, but she had also lit the way for others. As the stars blinked awake, she whispered to the night, "This is my life. I claimed it, I lived it, and I will never fade quietly again." And with that promise in her heart, Edith leaned back, content, ready for whatever new chapter tomorrow might bring.